In this lesson, we are going to take an introduction to the next of our major monarchs for AQA A-level history, focusing specifically on the reign of Henry VIII. This lesson is going to talk about the character and aims of Henry VIII, as well as the addressing of Henry VII's legacy. Now, this isn't going to be a particularly long lesson because ultimately we're going to just talk about the character of Henry VIII. We will talk about the evidence of his character development in his early reign and his later reign. We'll talk about his aims, and then we will think about how he deals with the legacy of his father, Henry VII. So we know that Henry VII dies in 1509. And he leaves this earth, shall we say, with his only surviving son, Henry VIII, or his oldest surviving son, Henry VIII, in charge, in taking the throne at a relatively young age. We'll get to that in a second. Ultimately, Henry VIII never was meant to be king, because he himself had an older brother, Prince Arthur, who would have taken the throne and would have been king had he not have died in 1502. And so we end up with Henry VIII. And if this was just a stable monarchy, a period of relative stability, and where not much happened like that of Henry VII, we probably wouldn't remember Henry VIII as a particularly meaningful monarch. As it so stands, though, Henry VIII is one of, if not probably the most famous of the English monarchs, and probably one of, if not the most famous of any monarch of all time. Often remembered for his dramatic break with the Catholic Church, his 6 marriages, his larger-than-life personality, his larger-than-life physicality, all of which, of course, essentially solidifies him and immortalizes him as one of the most important characters in all of English history. So, Henry VIII's character then was particularly multifaceted. He is credited with being, in his early reign, very charismatic, very confident, and very enthusiastic, often exploring and showing a love for intellectual pursuits. He was very good at arts, he was very, very good at sports, and he was best known for his physical strength, his athleticism, and his musical talent. The early reign of Henry VIII saw him engaging with humanist ideas, such as those espoused by scholars like Erasmus, for example, who he can even compose music himself. He was very much involved in governance. He was also not very much involved in governance, unlike his father, Henry VII. And ultimately, what we start to see that is, as time passes, Henry's character becomes more and more volatile, becomes more and more influenced by his desires, and particularly his longing for a male heir, and his increasingly autocratic approach to his rule. So, fundamentally, Henry would develop a period in which he was very quick to anger, often very temperamental. His health would then start to deteriorate, especially after what we believe to be a jousting accident in 1536. His mood becomes darker, and he becomes more and more tyrannical, fundamentally. His personal life was marked by tumultuous marriages and the executions of his wives, as well as many of his courtiers. And so we can sort of divide his reign into this sort of period. His early reign he was admired for his youthful energy and his passion. And it was sort of seen in his early reign that he would potentially just carry on, albeit with a few differences, which we'll get to, but ultimately he will carry on the legacy of his father. He kept a very structured government and council structure early on. He was a little bit more aggressive in terms of foreign policy, but far less so than he does get to in later on in his reign. But it seemed that the legacy of Henry VII was potentially intact in the earlier years of his reign. His later reign, however, became particularly different, let's just say. He essentially becomes increasingly autocratic and paranoid. His decision to break from the Catholic Church and create the Church of England was motivated by his personal desires. He would ultimately execute a number of his close advisors and his wives, people like Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and Thomas Cromwell, again, demonstrating his increasing ruthlessness and his volatility. Henry had several key aims in terms of his ambitions, some of which were personal, others were related to his view of England's place in Europe. The most significant of his aims was to secure a male heir. Now, his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon was politically motivated to solidify an alliance with Spain, but after failing to produce a male heir, Henry sought a divorce in order to marry Anne Boleyn. This desire for a male heir then drove many of Henry's most significant actions, including the break from Rome, the so-called King's Great Matter, and ultimately his persistence in securing a son was fulfilled with the birth of Edward VI, but only after quite a significant amount of political, religious, and personal upheaval. Another of his aims was to assert control over the Church of England. While initially a devout Catholic, Henry VIII sought the Pope's approval for his divorce with Catherine. When Pope Clement VII refused to do so, Henry took a radical step of breaking from the Roman Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England with himself the supreme head. The decision was deeply tied to his personal desires, but also the broader political aims. By gaining control of the Church of England, Henry was able to then strengthen his own authority and to enrich the crown through things like the dissolution of the monasteries, creating for him a significant amount of personal wealth. And then Henry had quite interesting military and political ambitions. He was inspired by people like Henry V, the sort of tumultuous and triumphant kings of the 100 Years' War, going in and taking land and conquering France, the idea of a warrior king mentality. And so he invested heavily in military campaigns of that nature, particularly in France. These campaigns often proved very costly, didn't really yield any lasting results, and his rivalry with France and his involvement in the European power struggles of the time were part of a broader aim of his to elevate his prestige as a warrior king, but also to elevate the prestige of England within the broader European infrastructure. So with all this being said then, what was the legacy of Henry VII, and what was left of his legacy? Well, there are sort of 2 or 3, or maybe even 4, in fact, points about his legacy. So you could argue that his financial management was a very, very important part of his legacy. One of the things that Henry VII left for his son Henry VIII was a very large treasury, up to as much as 1.8 million in pounds. This large treasury had been almost entirely depleted within the first few years of Henry VIII's reign as the result of wars with France and wars with Scotland and all these different kinds of things. Ultimately, that was one area of Henry VII's legacy that was completely stampled on by Henry VIII. What about stability and succession? Well, Henry VII was very careful in handling the succession and his establishment of a sustainable, relatively stable reign during the reign of Henry VIII. Arguably, you could argue that this was a part of the legacy that did continue, because even though it was tumultuous, the reign of Henry VIII's, the succession did still hold, and we still do get the succession from Henry to Edward, even at a very young age, in fact, when Edward became king, from Edward then to Mary, and then from Mary to Elizabeth, probably the most triumphant of all of the Tudor monarchs. In terms of his foreign policy, again, Henry VII left a legacy of a very cautious foreign policy, relatively peaceful, a significant departure from the conflict-ridden reigns of the previous monarchies. Henry VIII, however, pursued a far more aggressive foreign policy, particularly with France and the Holy Roman Empire and Scotland, and therefore completely stumbled on that part of his legacy as well. You could also talk about the fact that Henry VII left a relatively stable and relatively pragmatic government structure. He had a King's Council, he had the Council Learned in Law, which was able to essentially extract royal finances. Henry VIII also did away with those by the 1520s. In terms of the Council Learned, that was completely shut down almost immediately with the execution of Epsom and Dudley in 1510. But we also see that the sort of the conciliar government, the idea of having a council government structure, was also thrown away by the 1520s, when we see Henry VIII this being, increasingly rely on single individuals to basically do the work of government structure to get what he wanted, beginning with people like Thomas Wolsey, and then ultimately with Thomas Cromwell as well. And you can sort of divide, we'll get to this in the next lesson when we talk about government and his reign, but you could sort of divide his reign, Henry VIII's, in terms of government structure, into a period of three sections. The early part of his reign is marked by having a conciliar government, a structured government structure that relied on councils, Court of Star Chamber, etc., etc. And then for a huge middle period of his reign, from sort of 1520s to the late 1530s, we can see that he relies increasingly on individual people. He relies on Wolsey, he relies on Cromwell to get things done. And then when we get into the 1540s to 1547, towards the end of his reign, towards his death, you get a period of returning to the conciliar government structure, which is just a very interesting point that we need to think about. We'll talk about his ministers in future lessons. We'll talk about Wolsey, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, and we'll talk about his domestic policies, the King's Great Matter, the dissolution of the monasteries, all of that in the next lesson as well. And ultimately, for now, you could probably conclude that in terms of his legacy, the legacy of Henry VII, almost all of it had been dissolved, or almost all of it had been done away with by the sort of first 10 years, by sort of 1519 or 1520, the first 10 years into the reign of Henry VIII.